The journal lay open on a desk near a window, its pages dense with ink. Outside, the city of Amsterdam moved through its ordinary evening, but here, in the lamplight, the pages held something else entirely. 14 years of mornings, each one recorded in careful sequence, each entry set down before the details could fade. Frederick von Eden had been keeping this record since 1898. By the time he gathered his notes and prepared to present them formally, he had cataloged 352 individual dream events, each one selected from a larger body of observations, each one annotated with the particular quality he had come to regard as the defining feature of the experience. The dreamer, asleep and dreaming, who knew with full clarity that the events unfolding around them were not waking life, not merely strange, not vaguely uncertain, clearly, verifiably, an experience happening inside sleep, while a kind of waking reflective awareness persisted alongside it. He called these experiences lucid dreams. The word was precise. It did not mean vivid or unusual or especially memorable. It described a specific quality of cognitive clarity. The same word applied to a clear sky, to a mind free of confusion, to a piece of reasoning that held together without gaps. A lucid dream, in Van Eden's careful taxonomy, was a dream accompanied by something that resembled waking thought. The dreamer reflecting on the dream, recognizing it as a dream, sometimes choosing how to move through it, all while remaining entirely within the biological state of sleep. In 1913, he presented his catalog to the Society for Psychical Research in London. The presentation was formal, methodical, and grounded in a body of first-person documentation that had been accumulating quietly for over a decade before any of his contemporaries took the subject seriously as a matter of systematic study. He read from the journal. He described the character of the experiences. He drew distinctions between different classes of dream, placing the lucid variety within a larger phenomenological map. What he did not have, what no one had yet, was any way to verify from the outside that the experience was happening at all. That would take another 62 years, a laboratory in the north of England, a young researcher with a precise and patient mind, and a single dreamer willing to sleep wired to machines in the unfamiliar dark. Before that laboratory, the phenomenon lived entirely within the private record of individual dreamers. The reports existed. They came from many directions, across many centuries, and from traditions with no connection to each other. They described the same thing, a mind that became, in the middle of sleep, aware of its own dreaming. Among the earliest systematic engagements with this quality of mind is the practice known as dream yoga, which Tibetan Buddhist monks were cultivating deliberately as early as the 8th century of the Common Era. The monastery where this practice was developed and transmitted sat at altitude, stone and silence, the thin cold air of high ground, the world below retreating into distance. Before dawn, in the hours when sleep is at its most layered and most strange, monks sat and practiced stillness and applied to sleep the same quality of attentive awareness they brought to waking meditation. Dream yoga was not a casual phenomenon or a side observation. It was a formal discipline embedded within a larger system of contemplative practice, with its own methods of cultivation and its own lineage of teachers. The purpose was not curiosity about the sleeping mind. The purpose was the extension of meditative awareness into every state of consciousness, including sleep, including the dream. Awareness that could be sustained through sleep was awareness that had become, in the tradition's understanding, genuinely continuous. The records of this practice are among the oldest sustained engagements with the phenomenon of dream awareness anywhere in the written world. They describe, in the language of their tradition, precisely what Van Eden would describe 18 centuries later in the language of European phenomenology, a mind that knows it is dreaming and does not thereby wake. Further still in time, and on different ground entirely, Aristotle left a description in his writings of a dreamer who pauses mid-experience and recognizes the fabric of what surrounds him as something other than waking reality. The observation is brief, and it is tucked within a larger discussion of the nature of sleep and perception. It does not develop into a theory, but it is precise, and it is clearly drawn from something Aristotle considered worth recording: the moment of recognition, the dreamer's awareness of the dream state while still inside it. Centuries after Aristotle, the medieval Islamic scholar Ibn al-Rashid documented the awareness that can arise during dreaming as a notable property of the sleeping mind, placing it within a broader inquiry into the nature of experience and the capacity of the intellect to remain active across different states of consciousness. The observation was not incidental. It appeared within a serious intellectual framework, treated as a phenomenon worth understanding rather than a curiosity worth dismissing. What these records share is not a theory. What they share is an observation, the same observation, arriving independently across time and culture and intellectual tradition, each time carrying the same quiet strangeness: a mind asleep, a mind aware, both at once. For most of recorded history, the only evidence for this state was the account of the person who had experienced it. That account was offered after waking, shaped by memory, and impossible to verify from any external position. A researcher could read the journal, a physician could listen to the report, a scholar could compare one account with another and note the similarities, but there was no instrument, no measurement, no physical trace that could confirm from the outside what the dreamer claimed to have experienced from the inside. The problem was not one of credibility. Many of the people who reported lucid dreaming were careful observers who described their experiences with patience and precision. The problem was structural. The dream state was by its nature private. It happened inside the sleeping brain and left no trace that could be read from the waking side of the boundary. Sleep research as a discipline was still young, its tools were still limited, and the idea of communicating across the sleep boundary in real time had not yet arrived. It arrived in 1975 in a university sleep laboratory in Hull, and it arrived because of a small but specific fact about the biology of sleep that most researchers had not yet thought to use. During the phase of sleep in which most vivid dreaming occurs, that phase of deep inward activity in which the body lies almost perfectly still while the eyes move rapidly beneath their lids, the body's muscles are suppressed in a way that is both thorough and consistent. The brainstem during this state sends signals that prevent the voluntary muscles from acting on the movements generated in the dreaming mind. This suppression is widespread and reliable. Without it, the sleeper would act out every movement made in the dream, and sleep would become dangerous. But the suppression is not total. One group of muscles retains its normal mobility throughout this state. The extraocular muscles, the small paired muscles that move the eyes within their sockets, are not subject to the same broad suppression that holds the rest of the body in its biological stillness. The eyes move, the body does not. This is why the phase has the name it does. Rapid eye movement sleep takes its name from this one preserved exception, the visible movement of the eyes behind closed lids, darting and sweeping in patterns that have no direct correlation with what the dreamer sees, but which announce, unmistakably to any observer watching the lids, that the sleeping brain is in a particular and distinctive state. Keith Hearn, working toward his doctorate at the University of Hull, understood something about this exception that had not been fully explored. If the extraocular muscles remained mobile during this state, and if a dreamer became lucid, became aware within the dream that they were dreaming, then it might be possible for that dreamer to move their eyes deliberately in a pre-agreed pattern as a signal from inside the dream to the researchers waiting on the other side. The signal would not travel through words or speech or any of the channels of ordinary communication. It would travel through the one channel the body had left open, the eyes. Hearn made an agreement with a man named Alan Worsley. Worsley had experience with lucid dreaming. He was willing to spend nights in the laboratory, sleeping with electrodes attached to his scalp and to the skin near his eyes, while the polygraph machine ran its paper trace through the night, recording the slow biological language of his sleeping brain. If he achieved lucidity, if, inside a dream, he became aware that he was dreaming, he would move his eyes in a pre-agreed pattern. Left, right, right. A deliberate sweep, distinct in its regularity from the irregular scatter of ordinary rapid eye movement activity. The laboratory at night would have been quiet. The instruments made their own sounds, the soft mechanical movement of the polygraph, the low hum of the equipment, the slow continuous passage of paper through the recording head. Worsley lay in the dark, breathing at rest, the electrodes tracking each change in the biological state of his brain and body. Hearn or one of his colleagues sat nearby, watching. The polygraph trace ran through the night without the signal. Sleep has its own architecture, and the particular state in which lucid dreaming most often occurs does not arrive immediately after sleep begins. It comes later in the night, in the longer, richer sleep periods that deepen across the hours, where the paper accumulated, the night continued, and then, on the morning of April 12, 1975, the polygraph trace showed what Hearn had hoped to see. The trace showed confirmed REM sleep, the brainwave signature of that deeply active inward state, the almost complete suppression of voluntary muscle movement recorded in the channels that track the body's skeletal muscles. And in the electrooculographic channel, the channel that tracked the position of the eyes, there appeared a sequence of lateral eye movements unlike the irregular scatter of ordinary REM activity. They were deliberate, they were regular, they were the pre-agreed signal, 2 deliberate sweeps of the eyes, clean, intentional arcs moving through the polysomnographic record like a sentence appearing in the middle of static. Alan Worsley, lying in measured biological stillness with his body held in the near-complete paralysis of REM sleep, had moved his eyes on purpose from inside a dream. The signal had crossed the boundary. What Hearn had achieved was not merely a curiosity. It was the transformation of an entirely subjective experience into an empirically observable event. The dream had left a mark. Not a memory, not a report, not a retrospective account offered after waking, an actual physical trace, time-stamped by the polygraph machine, embedded in the simultaneous record of the brain's own sleep signatures, verifiable by anyone who read the paper. The verification required more than the eye signal alone. Hearn needed to confirm that the signal had occurred during genuine REM sleep, not during a transitional state or a lighter stage that might resemble it superficially. The simultaneous record of brain activity needed to show the characteristic pattern of REM. The muscle tone channel needed to show the broad suppression of voluntary movement that defines that state. The absence of other sleep features, the distinct slow waves and brief sleep spindles that mark non-REM stages, needed to be confirmed. All of these conditions appeared together at the moment of the signal. The sleeping brain had communicated with the waking world from inside a verified dream. The result was not immediately famous. Hearn's findings circulated within a limited academic context, and the publication history of his work was uneven. The scientific community's engagement with the result was cautious. The subject matter was unusual. The finding was extraordinary in its implications, and extraordinary findings require not just initial demonstration, but replication, independent confirmation, and the slow accumulation of corroborating evidence from researchers who did not know each other and who worked in different institutions under different conditions. That replication came. It came from Stephen LaBerge. LaBerge was working at Stanford University in California without direct knowledge of Hearn's earlier work. He arrived at the same logic independently: the preserved mobility of the extraocular muscles, the possibility of a pre-agreed signal, the polysomnographic record as the medium through which that signal could be verified and time-stamped. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he developed the eye signal protocol into a rigorous and reproducible experimental method. LaBerge published one of the first peer-reviewed accounts of laboratory-verified lucid dreaming using this method in 1980. The publication appeared in a scientific journal, accompanied by the physiological data, the polysomnographic records, and the subjective reports collected from participants immediately upon waking. The dreamer's own account of the moment of lucidity aligned with the timestamp of the ocular signal in the recording. The accounts matched, the signals matched, the brainwave and muscle tone records confirmed the state. The method was reproducible. Other laboratories could apply it. Other researchers could train participants in the technique, instrument them with the same recording equipment, and look for the same signal in the same channels of the same polysomnographic trace. And when they did, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Japan, they found it. Different laboratories, different researchers, different participants, different instruments, all receiving the same kind of signal from the same boundary of sleep. LaBerge continued the work over years, building a body of controlled studies that established lucid dreaming as not merely an anecdotal curiosity or a rare personal experience, but a cognitive state that occurred within verified and measurable biological conditions that could be produced with some reliability by trained individuals, and that could communicate with the waking world through the one channel the sleeping body left open. The laboratory at Stanford in this period was doing something that had not been done before. It was studying consciousness from the inside out, using the dreamer as a research instrument who could signal across the boundary in real time while the external instruments confirmed the biological context of that signal. Most sleep research at the time was observational. Researchers watched the sleeper from the outside. They recorded the brain waves, measured the eye movements, tracked the muscle tone, and drew conclusions about the sleeping brain's activity from those external measurements alone. What the sleeper experienced during those measurements was only recoverable after waking, through the imperfect medium of memory and language. LaBerge's protocol opened a different channel. The dreamer was not only a subject to be measured, the dreamer was an active participant who could indicate, in real time, the subjective state of the dream, its character, its content, the moment of lucidity itself, through a signal that appeared in the physiological record, alongside all the external measurements. The convergence of the internal signal with the external record made the lucid dream state uniquely verifiable. It was the only condition in which the gap between first-person experience and third-person measurement could be bridged in real time. Van Eden, in Amsterdam in 1913, had described the experience with great care and presented it to an audience of curious and skeptical scholars. He could not show them the dream. He could only describe it and asked them to take his careful observation seriously. What Hearn and LaBerge had done, in their separate ways in separate laboratories, was give the observation a body, not a description of the experience after the fact, but a physical trace of the experience as it happened, embedded in the continuous biological record of a sleeping human being. The journal that Van Eden had opened on his desk was filled with the written marks of remembered experience. The polygraph trace that Hearn's machine produced on the morning of April 12, 1975, was a different kind of mark entirely. Not memory, not language, not the reconstruction of a wakened mind reaching back for what the sleeping mind had felt. It was the event itself, registered in the moment it occurred, in the only medium available, two deliberate sweeps of the eyes through the quiet record of a sleeping brain. What the ancient traditions had called a particular quality of waking awareness within sleep, what the Tibetan monks had cultivated over centuries of nocturnal practice, what Aristotle had noted briefly and Ibn al-Rashid had examined with more deliberate attention, all of it had finally found its physical correlate in the long paper trace of a polygraph machine running through the night. The phenomenon that had been privately experienced and carefully recorded and passed from one solitary observer to another across more than 2 millennia had, in a darkened sleep laboratory in Hull, made contact with the instruments of modern empirical science. It had done so through the eyes, through the one exception the sleeping body allowed, through two small sweeping movements that carried, in their deliberate regularity, a message across the boundary that had always separated the dreaming mind from the waking world, that awareness was present, that the dream was known to be a dream, that the sleeper on the inside was reaching out to the scientists on the outside and telling them so. Before that morning, lucid dreaming was a private experience, documented in private records, reported after the fact, impossible to confirm from any position outside the dreamer's own consciousness. After that morning, it was a measured event in a physiological record, verifiable in principle by any researcher who knew how to read the trace. The work that followed built on this foundation through decades of careful extension. LaBerge and his collaborators trained participants. They refined the protocol. They cross-validated physiological signals with subjective reports. They extended the method from simple bilateral eye signals to more complex communication tasks, asking dreamers to signal specific dream activities and then matching those signals against changes in the physiological record, respiratory patterns, muscle activity, the small but measurable echoes of the dreaming body acting on the dream. Other researchers replicated the findings in different countries, with different participants, in laboratories that had no direct connection to Stanford or Hull. The signal kept appearing. The polysomnographic confirmation kept arriving. The subjective reports kept aligning with the timestamps of the ocular events. The cumulative weight of this evidence was not dramatic in the way that a single spectacular result is dramatic. It was quieter and more durable. It was the weight of convergence, many independent observations arriving at the same finding from different directions and different distances. The particular stillness of a thing that has been confirmed by strangers in different rooms. Frederick von Eden's journal contained 352 entries, gathered over 14 years, each one a careful record of a morning memory. The journal was patient and private and precise. It did not ask to be believed. It simply recorded, in dated sequence, what had been experienced, trusting that the accumulation of careful description was itself a kind of argument. The polysomnographic trace that received Alan Worsley's signal from inside confirmed REM sleep was not a collection of memories. It was a collection of moments, each pen stroke the real-time registration of a biological event, each channel a separate voice in the continuous biological speech of a sleeping human body. The two deliberate eye movements appeared in that record, not as a memory of something that had happened, but as the thing itself preserved in its moment. Between the journal and the trace lay 62 years, an ocean, and the entire distance between first-person phenomenology and third-person measurement. On one side of that distance, a Dutch psychiatrist sitting at his desk each morning, reaching back into the night for what his sleeping mind had seen. On the other side, a polygraph machine running its paper through the night, its pens drawing the quiet story of a brain in REM sleep, while somewhere inside that brain, a dreamer chose to move his eyes. The Tibetan monks at their practice in the hours before dawn, the sleeping figure at the edge of Aristotle's observation, Ibn al-Rashid, attending with patience to the properties of the dreaming mind, Van Eden at his desk with his dated entries, Hearn in his laboratory, watching the pen across the paper, all of them, across their distances of time and language and tradition, had been keeping company with the same phenomena, a mind that, in the middle of sleep, became aware of its own dreaming. In the long paper trace of the polygraph, two sweeping lines appeared in the electro-oculographic channel, clean and deliberate against the irregular scatter of ordinary RM activity. The brain continued its deep biological work. The body lay in its biological stillness, the atonia held. The RM signature persisted in the brainwave channels, undisturbed, and in the record, in the ink laid down by a mechanical pen against the moving paper, there was the signal, steady, unmistakable, and precisely where Hearn had hoped to find it, arriving from inside a verified dream, crossing in the only way it could, through the eyes of a sleeping man who knew he was asleep. Two lines, small enough to fit in the margin of a page, large enough in what they represented to close a distance that had been open for a very long time. The paper continued to move through the machine. The pens continued to draw. The night continued in its quiet biological course, the body breathing, the brain doing whatever it is that brains do in the deep hours of RM sleep when they are not being watched from the inside and the outside at the same time. But it had happened. The signal had arrived, and in that arrival, something that had been witnessed and recorded and practiced and described across more than 2,000 years of human experience had, for the first time, been confirmed from the outside in real time, quietly, precisely, and without ceremony, in a darkened room on an ordinary April morning in 1975. The polygraph machine did not know what it had recorded. The paper did not know what it carried. The instruments simply did what instruments do. They registered the moment, preserved it in its physical form, and left it in the record for anyone who wished to read it. The two lines remained there, in the long continuous trace, surrounded by the familiar biological signatures of deep REM sleep, the brainwave activity, the muscle suppression, the irregular scatter of ordinary eye movement on either side, holding within their brief regularity the quiet confirmation that somewhere behind the closed eyes of a sleeping man, a mind had been awake enough to send them. A line appears on a page. It is thin, almost weightless, drawn by a pen moving steadily across the slow scroll of paper at a fraction of an inch per second. Around it, other lines move too, the quiet undulations of a sleeping body declaring its own depth. But this one line is different. It swings. It swings left, then right, then left again. Two deliberate arcs cut through the otherwise irregular scatter of the record, and in that swing is contained something that, at the moment of its first appearance, no instrument had ever captured before. A mind, asleep, sending a message received. To understand what that line means, it is necessary to travel inward, not into the laboratory, and not into the history that preceded it, but into the brain itself, into the specific electrical and metabolic territory that separates a lucid dream from any other state the sleeping body passes through. The signal on the paper is a fact. What produced it is a landscape. The landscape begins with frequency. During the deepest ordinary phases of sleep, the brain moves slowly. Its electrical rhythms are wide and rolling, like long swells crossing open water, each wave lasting nearly a second from crest to crest, the whole system moving at a pace that is almost geological in its calm. These are the slow rhythms of rest, of consolidation, of the body doing the long maintenance work that waking life does not allow. They are ancient rhythms, they are deep, and they tell very little about the kind of awareness the brain is capable of. But REM sleep is different. In REM sleep, the slow swells flatten and quicken. The brain's electrical signature shifts towards something that resembles the waking state. Low amplitude, high frequency, a kind of constant fine-grained restlessness spread across the whole cortical surface. The waves still move, but now they are short and rapid, more like the surface of a river over stones than the open rolling sea. The body, meanwhile, is held nearly motionless, its muscles loosened almost to paralysis by a signal from the brainstem. The brain is awake inside a body that cannot move. And into that particular combination of conditions, vivid dreaming arrives. Still, even within the complexity of REM, something is missing. The missing thing is not activity. The dreaming brain in ordinary REM is intensely active, more active in some respects than it is during quiet waking life. The missing thing is a specific kind of activity concentrated in a specific region of a specific and measurable frequency. Its absence is the ordinary dream. Its return is the lucid one. In the early years of EEG research into dreaming, the instruments available could resolve frequency well enough to distinguish sleep stages, but not well enough to isolate activity within them at fine temporal resolution. As the technology refined, as the number of electrodes increased, as signal processing became more precise, as the ability to localize electrical sources within the brain improved, a question became possible to ask that had previously been too specific to approach. Not simply whether the brain was more active during a lucid dream, but where that activity arose, at what frequency, and at exactly what moment it appeared. The question was answered, in part by a study published in the year 2009. A team led by Ursula Voss, working with colleagues including Rainer Holzmann, Inka Tuin, and J. Allen Hobson, equipped experienced lucid dreamers with high-density EEG arrays and monitored them across the night. The participants had been trained in the eye signal protocol, the method of sweeping the eyes in a pre-agreed pattern to signal lucidity from within the dream, and when those signals arrived, the researchers were able to examine the brain's electrical state in the precise moments surrounding them. What they found was not simply that the brain was more active at those moments. What they found was that a specific band of very high-frequency oscillation had appeared over a specific region of the scalp with a precision that made it distinguishable from the background of ordinary REM. The frequency was approximately 40 cycles per second. 40 cycles per second is a rhythm that sits far above the rolling waves of deep sleep and above even the brisk rhythms of ordinary waking attention. It falls in a range that researchers call gamma, a band of electrical oscillation that has been associated across decades of neuroscience with the binding of perceptual information, with conscious attention, with the integration of separate neural processes into unified experience. In ordinary REM sleep, gamma activity is present but relatively low and scattered. At the moment of lucidity, in the Voss study, it rose sharply. It rose over the frontal lateral scalp, the regions of the skull that overlie the forehead, and the sides of the head above the temples. And it rose in a way that was coherent, not a scattered flicker distributed evenly across the brain, but a synchronized pattern, a set of distant regions moving together in the same rhythm, like instruments that have found a common tempo. Coherence matters more than raw amplitude. Two regions of the brain oscillating together at the same frequency are, in a functional sense, communicating their rhythms aligned in a way that makes the transfer of information between them efficient and stable. When frontolateral gamma coherence increased at the moment of lucidity, what the EEG record was showing was not simply a rise in electrical noise. It was showing two or more regions beginning to coordinate. The dream, which had been running on its own, was now being observed from somewhere, and somewhere was a place that could be measured. The frontolateral scalp overlies a region of cortex that includes the prefrontal areas, the forwardmost parts of the brain, pressed just behind the forehead, and the lateral regions extending backward toward the temples. These areas together constitute what neuroscientists call the frontolateral network, a set of structures deeply involved in the kind of thinking that monitors itself. Executive function lives here. Working memory lives here. The capacity to hold a plan in mind while acting is held here. And perhaps most relevantly for the lucid state, the capacity for reflective self-awareness, the ability to stand aside from one's own current experience and evaluate it, is dependent on the structural integrity and metabolic activity of this network. In ordinary REM sleep, this network goes quiet. That quieting is one of the most important features of the dreaming brain, and one of the most consequential. When the prefrontal regions reduce their activity during REM, the result is not simply a reduction in one cognitive function among many. The result is the removal of the mechanism most responsible for asking the critical question, is what I am experiencing real? In the ordinary dream, that question is never asked. Events that would strike the waking mind as clearly impossible, rooms that shift their geometry, people who are simultaneously two people, sequences of events that follow no temporal logic, pass through the dreaming mind without challenge. Not because the dreaming mind is passive, but because the system responsible for challenge has been metabolically dimmed. Functional imaging studies have given this dimming a visual form. In the images produced by positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging during REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex appears cool. In the color conventions typically used to represent metabolic activity, it runs blue and quiet against the warmer activation of the visual cortex, the limbic structures, and the motor association areas. The dreaming brain is not uniformly quiet. It is specifically and selectively quiet in the regions that would otherwise apply scrutiny to its own contents. Lucid dreaming is, among other things, the partial reversal of that quieting. The partial reversal is important. Not a full restoration. The lucid dreamer does not wake up in the ordinary sense, does not return to the complete prefrontal dominance of alert waking cognition. What happens is something more subtle and more particular. Within the continued context of REM sleep, within the continued presence of vivid hallucinatory imagery and the biological machinery of the dream, a portion of the prefrontal machinery comes back online. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a region positioned roughly behind the temples toward the back of the prefrontal region, shows increased metabolic activity in functional scans taken during verified lucid dreaming compared to ordinary REM, not the full activity of waking, to partial return, a warming. That warming is sufficient to change everything about the experience. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is not a structure whose function is singular or easily summarized. It participates in many overlapping processes, holding several pieces of information in mind at once, planning a sequence of actions over time, monitoring the relationship between current behavior and intended goals, and perhaps most relevantly, for supporting the kind of meta-level cognition that takes one's own mental states as their object. When a person waking thinks about what they are thinking, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is engaged. When a person remembers not just the content of a past event, but what it was like to experience it, this region participates. When a person is aware of being aware, not just seeing, but knowing they are seeing, this part of the brain is part of the circuit. In the ordinary dream, it is largely absent from that circuit. Its low metabolic state means its contributions are reduced or unavailable. The dream runs forward on the basis of its own generative momentum, drawing on memory and emotion and sensory imagination without the moderating influence of reflective self-monitoring. At the onset of lucidity, the circuit changes. The change is not instantaneous in the metabolic sense. Functional imaging, which measures blood flow changes over periods of seconds, cannot resolve the exact moment of the shift in the way that EEG can. But the picture assembled from both methods together tells a coherent story. Electrically, there is a rapid rise in high-frequency coherence over frontolateral scalp regions at the moment of the signal. Metabolically, there is increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in a set of parietal and prefrontal regions that together constitute the frontoparietal network. These two lines of evidence, drawn from methods that measure different aspects of neural function at different temporal scales, converge on the same conclusion: something structural and functional has changed at the moment of lucidity, and that change is specifically located in the circuits responsible for self-aware cognition. The parietal contribution is worth pausing on. Parietal regions positioned toward the top and back of the brain, above the ears, participate in functions that are less obviously connected to executive cognition, but are, on reflection, deeply relevant to the lucid state. The precuneus, a region tucked into the medial surface of the parietal lobe, folds of cortex that face the interior gap between the two hemispheres, is one of the most consistently activated regions in studies of self-referential processing. It is engaged when a person thinks about themselves in relation to others, when they recall episodic memories with a first-person perspective, when they imagine future scenarios in which they are the protagonist. It is, in a loose but meaningful sense, the region most associated with the sense that there is a continuous self at the center of experience. In ordinary REM sleep, precuneus activity is reduced. In lucid dreaming, it recovers. The functional imaging studies that have compared bold signal, a proxy for local metabolic demand, between verified lucid and non-lucid REM periods have found the precuneus among the regions most reliably showing increased activation during lucidity, and with it, the inferior parietal lobule, an adjacent region involved in the sense of agency, in the experience of actions as one's own rather than externally imposed, in the capacity to locate oneself as the author of experience rather than simply its recipient. What the parietal activations suggest is something richer than simply the prefrontal cortex switched back on. What they suggest is that lucidity involves the reinstatement of a self-model, a running representation of the individual as a coherent entity located in a particular perspective, capable of agency, continuous across time. In the ordinary dream, that self model is partial and unstable, capable of producing a character who acts and experiences, but not one who observes and evaluates. In the lucid dream, the self model becomes more complete. The sleeper does not simply inhabit the dream, they know they are inhabiting it. And the regions responsible for generating the sense of a located, continuous, reflective self are the regions that have come back online. There is a region that sits between the prefrontal and the parietal, anatomically between them, and functionally between them too, that appears in the high-density EEG data as one of the primary sources of the enhanced gamma signal. It is a long curved strip of cortex that runs in a band above and behind the corpus callosum, the thick bridge of fibers connecting the two hemispheres. It is called the anterior cingulate cortex. Its position in the brain is unusual, not on the outer surface in the way most cortical regions are, but folded into the groove that runs between the two hemispheres. Its tissue pressed against the interior space of the brain in a way that gives it access to signals from a very wide range of sources. From its position, it receives input from the prefrontal cortex, above and in front, from the limbic structures below and behind, from the sensory cortices and the motor areas, from the thalamus and the brainstem. It is, in a structural sense, a convergence zone, a place where many different streams of neural information meet. The functions attributed to the anterior cingulate cortex are as varied as its connections. It participates in conflict monitoring, the detection of situations in which competing responses are simultaneously activated, requiring a decision about which to follow. It participates in error detection, the recognition that something has gone wrong relative to an expectation. It participates in the regulation of emotional responses, in the attention directed toward pain, in the experience of social exclusion, in the processing of uncertainty. Its activity rises when the brain is confronted with something that does not fit, when the world presents a situation that the current model of reality cannot comfortably accommodate. In the lucid dream, that description becomes almost literal. The anterior cingulate cortex is, if the high-density EEG source analysis is taken seriously, one of the generators of the gamma coherence observed at the onset of lucidity. Its activity rises at the moment the dreamer's internal state shifts from passive immersion to active self-awareness. And the functional sense of what that activity might represent is not difficult to construct. The dreamer is in a state in which two deeply incompatible descriptions of reality are simultaneously true. The experience is vivid, present, perceptually convincing. The dream world is phenomenologically real in the most immediate and direct sense. And simultaneously, through the partial restoration of prefrontal and parietal function, the dreamer knows that this convincing present reality is not happening outside the brain, it is happening inside it. The world and the knowledge that it is not a world are both present at once. That is a conflict, and the anterior cingulate cortex is a structure that has spent its evolutionary history monitoring conflicts exactly. The high-density EEG studies, including work from Voss and from teams at institutions including the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, have refined the source analysis of the gamma signal to locate its probable generators with increasing precision. The picture that emerges is not of a single region switching on, but of a network, a set of regions beginning to coordinate, to oscillate together, to align their rhythms in a way that functionally links them. The anterior cingulate is a node in that network. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a node. The precuneus and inferior parietal lobule are nodes. What the gamma coherence represents in functional terms is the formation of a circuit, the assembly, from components that were present but not connected, of a system capable of holding two descriptions of reality simultaneously without either one dissolving the other. The assembly of that circuit is measured in milliseconds, but its consequences are measured in the entire changed quality of the experience. It is worth sitting with the chemical substrate of all of this, because the electrical activity visible in the EEG and the metabolic changes visible in functional imaging both rest on a chemical foundation that is itself characteristic of the REM state. REM sleep is chemically defined, in large part by the rise of one neurotransmitter system and the fall of two others. The rising system is cholinergic, driven by the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, released from specialized nuclei in the brainstem into the wider forebrain during REM. Acetylcholine, in this context, acts as a broad activating signal. It sustains the desynchronized, high-frequency EEG activity that characterizes REM. It promotes the generation of vivid sensory imagery. It supports the activation of the visual cortex, the motor association areas, the limbic structures, all the machinery of the dream narrative. The cholinergic tide of REM is in a sense what makes dreaming possible. The falling systems are aminergic, serotonin and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters, whose presence during waking life modulates mood, attention, and the application of logical constraint to ongoing cognition, are nearly absent during REM-N. Their aminergic neurons, located in the raphe nuclei and the locus coeruleus respectively, reduce their firing to levels that approach silence during REM sleep. This near silence is not incidental. These are the systems that during waking contribute to the critical evaluation of experience, the sense that something is wrong, the application of context and prior knowledge to current perception, the recognition of implausibility. Their suppression during REM is part of what allows the dream to proceed without interruption, without the ordinary constraints of logic and reality testing. The combination of high cholinergic drive and low aminergic tone creates a very specific kind of cognitive environment. Vivid imagery is generated freely. Emotional content is processed with particular intensity through an activated amygdala. Narrative structures emerge and develop without critical scrutiny. The result is the ordinary dream, immersive, emotionally real, logically unconstrained, and experienced as entirely convincing. Against this neurochemical background, the partial prefrontal reactivation of the lucid state is all the more arresting. It does not require the cholinergic tide to recede. It does not require the aminergic silence to be broken. The lucid state arises within the same neurochemical context as ordinary REM, the same high acetylcholine, the same low serotonin and norepinephrine, but something additional has been added to that context, something that is visible in the electrical coherence and the metabolic warming of specific cortical regions, and that produces within the continued vividness of the dream the capacity for reflective self-awareness. What that something is, at the level of specific molecular or synaptic events that distinguish lucid from non-lucid REM, is not yet fully described. The research offers a picture at the level of regions and networks and frequencies, but the precise cascade of cellular events that generates the gamma coherence, that warms the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that reactivates the precuneus and the anterior cingulate, that sequence remains an open question. The instruments available describe the state with increasing resolution. The mechanism that initiates the state is less well understood. That open question is not a problem with the evidence. It is the natural shape of research that has been advancing steadily for several decades, and that has, in each advance revealed a new and more specific question hidden behind the one it answered. The brainstem that drives the REM state is worth a moment of its own attention because it is the original engine of everything visible in the cortex above it. Deep at the base of the brain, below the thick folds of the cortex and below the curved structures of the limbic system, the brainstem extends downward like a stalk, carrying signals from the body's peripheral systems into the higher regions of the brain and back down again. Within it, small clusters of specialized neurons project their chemical signals upward into the forebrain with effects that are disproportionate to their number. The cholinergic nuclei of the brainstem, the pedunculopontine tegmental nucleus, and the latorodorsal tegmental nucleus, though their names carry less weight than their function, are the sources of the acetylcholine flood that defines REM. Their firing rate rises as the night progresses through its cycles, and with it, the duration and intensity of each successive REM period deepens. It is from this brainstem activation that the EEG activity of REM arises. The cholinergic signal travels upward through the thalamus, the brain's primary relay station, and from there spreads across the cortex in patterns that promote the desynchronized, high-frequency activity characteristic of the dreaming state. The thalamus, which during deep non-REM sleep generates the rhythmic bursts of activity that produce sleep spindles and K-complexes, the quiet architectural signatures of the consolidating brain, shifts into a different mode during REM, passing sensory-like information to the cortex that the cortex experiences as real sensory input, even in the absence of anything arriving from the body's actual senses. This is what makes the dream world so convincing. The thalamus is the gatekeeper of sensory experience. What it passes to the cortex treats as real. In REM sleep, the thalamus passes to the cortex a signal generated internally by the brainstem's activation of memory traces and associative networks, and the cortex has no reliable way to distinguish that internally generated signal from an externally generated one. The ordinary dream is, in this sense, the brain experiencing its own memory and imagination as if they were the present world. What the lucid state adds to this is not a change in the thalamic signal. The dream continues to feel real. What it adds is a second layer, a prefrontal and parietal commentary running alongside the experience, capable of reaching the conclusion that the experience is internally generated, even while the internally generated experience continues in full. The frontoparietal network is capable of that conclusion because it has access to information that the purely thalamocortical dream system does not integrate. It has access to the temporal context of the experience, the knowledge that the sleeper went to bed, that time has passed in a particular way, that the environment surrounding the body is the bedroom and not the landscape of the dream. It has access to the inconsistencies of the dream environment, the details that do not quite cohere, the physics that does not quite hold, the background elements that shift without explanation, and it has the capacity to compare ongoing experience against a model of expected reality and to notice the mismatch. When the frontoparietal network is fully metabolically suppressed, as in ordinary REM, those capacities are unavailable and the mismatch goes unnoticed. When the network partially reactivates, the mismatch surfaces. The moment of surfacing is the moment of lucidity. The EEG captures it as a rise in gamma coherence. The functional scan captures it as a warming of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The dreamer experiences it as the strange, clear, quiet knowledge that the world they are moving through is made entirely of their own mind. That knowledge, once arrived at, is sustained by the same network that produced it. In the minutes after the moment of lucidity, in the sustained lucid state that follows the initial recognition, The frontoparietal network continues to show elevated activity relative to ordinary REM. The gamma coherence does not spike and immediately fall. It persists. The anterior cingulate continues its work. The dreamer continues to hold both descriptions of reality simultaneously, the vivid and the known to be fabricated, without one collapsing the other. It is a balance that requires something, not effort in the ordinary sense. The lucid dreamer does not report straining to maintain the state in the way one strains to maintain balance on an unstable surface. The state is fragile in ways that are consistent with its neural basis. Moments of high emotional intensity within the dream, fear, excitement, strong desire, are frequently reported as destabilizing for lucidity, and this is consistent with the capacity of limbic activation to overwhelm the prefrontal modulation that the lucid state depends on. The amygdala, whose emotional processing runs hot in REM, can, in moments of sufficient activation, effectively reclaim the cognitive territory that prefrontal reactivation had temporarily occupied. The balance can also tip in the other direction. A dreamer who becomes too strongly aware, who focuses with too great an intensity on the fact that they are dreaming, on the details of the dream environment, on the effort of maintaining lucidity, sometimes reports that the dream dissolves and they wake. This is consistent with the idea that full prefrontal reactivation is not what the lucid state requires, but rather a specific and partial restoration, enough to produce reflective awareness, but not enough to break the thalamocortical loop that sustains the dream. The lucid state is, in the language of the neuroscience, a hybrid, not waking, not ordinary dreaming. A third state defined by specific combinations of activity that neither of the more familiar states produces alone. Its EEG signature is identifiably distinct from both. Its metabolic signature is identifiably distinct from both, and the experience it produces, vivid, present, perceptually real, and simultaneously known to be the brain's own fabrication, has no precise parallel in any other state the sleeping mind routinely achieves. There is something in the anatomy of the anterior cingulate cortex that is worth returning to because its physical form reflects something true about its function in the lucid state. It is a curved structure, and runs in an arc following the curve of the corpus callosum beneath it, tracing a bent ribbon of tissue that faces inward rather than outward, pressed into the gap between the hemispheres where the two halves of the brain are most closely adjacent. Its position makes it a bridge, not just in the functional sense of integrating diverse inputs, but in the literal spatial sense of occupying the middle territory between the two sides. It is simultaneously close to the prefrontal structures it helps coordinate and close to the limbic structures from which it receives emotional signal. It is, anatomically, exactly where it needs to be to do the work the lucid state requires of it. What the lucid state requires of it is the sustained maintenance of a contradiction. The dream is real. The dream is not real. Both propositions are true simultaneously, the first in the perceptual and phenomenological sense, the second in the cognitive and reflective sense. In ordinary waking life, the brain rarely encounters situations in which two mutually exclusive descriptions of reality must be held together for any extended period. Ambiguity is usually resolved. The conflict is usually temporary. The anterior cingulate monitors and the prefrontal cortex decides, and the world settles into a single description. In the lucid dream, no such resolution is available. The dream cannot be made less vivid by knowing it is a dream. The knowledge cannot be set aside without losing the lucidity. The two must coexist. And in the architecture of the brain, The structure most suited to sustaining that coexistence is the same structure identified in the source analysis of the gamma signal, the anterior cingulate cortex, curved and inward facing, simultaneously connected to everything it needs, and positioned precisely at the fold between the two hemispheres, holding both descriptions of the world with the steady, quiet patience of something that has been built over a very long time for exactly this kind of task. In the slow middle of a REM period, in a brain that is otherwise following the usual path of the dreaming state, the anterior cingulate holds those two truths together: the dream as felt reality, the dream as the brain's own making, while the gamma rhythm sustains its coherence across the frontolateral network, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex continues its quiet warming, while the precuneus and the inferior parietal lobule maintain the sense of a self that knows where it is. The dream continues, the world it contains goes on unfolding, and somewhere in the fold between the hemispheres, in the curved tissue of a structure that monitors contradiction for a living, the two descriptions of that world rest side by side without resolution, without collapse, held in a balance that requires the specific and improbable architecture of the lucid brain to sustain them both. Behind each eye, tucked into the bony socket of the skull, a small bundle of muscle fibers lies in the dark. During the deepest phases of sleep, when the body has surrendered its capacity for ordinary movement, when the arms will not lift and the legs will not respond, and the whole architecture of voluntary motion has been quietly suspended, those small muscles remain free. They can move, they can sweep left and right across the full range of their travel, as deliberate and precise as they are in open daylight. That single exception, that one narrow gap in the body's nightly stillness, became the foundation on which an entire science was built. The suspension of voluntary movement during dreaming sleep is nearly complete. The brainstem sends a steady signal down through the spinal cord, and the result is a kind of biological paralysis that holds the dreaming body in its bed while the mind travels elsewhere. Without that suppression, the body would act out its dreams, running, reaching, speaking, and the dreamer would wake entangled in whatever their sleeping mind had constructed. The paralysis is not a malfunction, it is a protection. But it also posed a problem for any researcher who wanted to know, in the moment, whether a sleeping person was aware of their own dreaming. The body that could have answered was largely locked away. The extraocular muscles, for reasons of their own anatomy and their particular relationship to the brainstem, were never part of that lock. They retained their mobility. And a researcher willing to think carefully about that exception could see in it the outline of a method. The sleeper is still. The room is dark and quiet around them. Their breathing has taken on the particular quality of deep sleep, slightly faster than ordinary rest, the chest moving in quick, shallow rhythms that belong to this strange phase of the night. The electrodes placed at the outer corners of each eye are recording the electrical field generated by the eye itself, which behaves like a small battery with a positive pole at the cornea and a negative pole at the back of the retina. When the eye moves, that battery tilts in space, and the voltage registered at the nearby electrode changes in a way that can be read with precision. A movement left, a movement right. Each one draws a clean arc in the flowing paper record of the machine. Natural dreaming sleep fills the electro-oculographic record with movement. The eyes flicker and dart, tracing arcs that seem to respond to whatever the dreaming mind is watching. Fast, irregular, following no predictable sequence. The record of a natural REM period looks like a rapid scatter, alive with small irregular sweeps. Against that background, two deliberate lateral movements, slow, controlled, executed in sequence, carrying the particular signature of an intentional action rather than the reflexive darting of a dreaming eye, stand out with a clarity that is difficult to mistake. The method required that the signal be agreed in advance. Before sleep, the participant and the researcher would establish a code, a specific number of lateral movements, made in a specific pattern to be executed at the moment the dreamer became aware they were dreaming. The dreamer would carry that agreement into sleep, into the dream, and at the moment of recognition would use the one part of the body still available to them to send a signal back across the boundary between sleep and waking. 2 deliberate sweeps to the left, then 2 to the right, or some agreed variation. The machine would record it. The researcher watching the trace would see it, and the question of whether the dreamer was truly aware at that moment of their own dreaming could be given a measurable answer. For the method to carry any scientific weight, the signal had to occur inside confirmed dreaming sleep. A participant who simply woke up and moved their eyes was not signaling from within a dream. A participant who made the movements in a lighter transitional stage of sleep was not providing the evidence the protocol needed. The verification required 3 things to be true at once and to be recorded simultaneously on the same continuous trace. The distinctive brainwave pattern of REM sleep had to be present. The electromyographic record, the channel measuring electrical activity in the muscles of the face and jaw, had to show the sustained low-level silence that indicates genuine atonia, and the pre-agreed eye movement signal had to appear within that window, not before it and not after it. 3 streams of data converging on a single moment, each one confirming what the others were also saying. There was a 4th condition applied as an additional safeguard against simpler explanations. The record had to be free of K-complexes, which are the large, slow waveforms associated with lighter sleep and brief arousal, and of sleep spindles, the characteristic bursting oscillations that mark the transition between sleep stages. The presence of either would place the signal in a different biological territory, one adjacent to dreaming but not quite within it. Their absence was part of the evidence. In a verified lucid dream signal, the brain waves were quiet in the particular way that REM sleep is quiet, not the broad, slow waves of deep sleep, not the scattered medium-frequency activity of lighter stages, but the low-amplitude, high-frequency desynchronized pattern that has, over decades of sleep research, come to be recognized as the electrical signature of the dreaming mind at work. The cross-referencing of all these channels was what transformed a personal report into a scientific observation. Without the physiological record, a dreamer's account of having been aware during sleep was interesting but not verifiable. Anyone might claim, upon waking, that they had known they were dreaming. Memory is reconstructive, and the boundary between dreaming and waking leaves its own distortions. The story a person tells about their dreams upon waking is shaped by the act of waking and by the narrative habits of the waking mind. A simultaneous biological record made in real time, carrying no distortion of retrospective memory, was of a different order entirely. It was evidence that did not depend on what the dreamer thought they remembered. What the dreamer thought they remembered still mattered. The full protocol included a detailed subjective account collected immediately after waking, within the first few minutes, before the dream had time to dissolve into the general amnesia of the morning. The dreamer would describe what had been happening in the dream at the moment they chose to signal, what the dream looked like, what state of awareness they had been in, what it felt like to recognize the dream as a dream while standing inside it. Those accounts were then compared to the timestamp of the ocular signal in the polysomnographic record. when the dreamer described making the deliberate eye movements from within the dream, when their account included the moment of choice, the feeling of reaching for the one available action, the execution of the agreed pattern, and when that description aligned with the physical record, the convergence of the two streams of evidence was of a kind that is difficult to explain by coincidence or confabulation. The first laboratory demonstrations of this kind were produced in the middle of the 1970s and extended through the decade that followed. One of the earliest came from a researcher at the University of Hull working with a single trained participant in a sleep laboratory equipped with standard polysomnographic recording equipment. The participant had practiced his ability to recognize the dream state from within it and had agreed in advance on the signal pattern. The night of the first successful recording was not a night of many signals. It was a night of one, a single verified instance of the pre-agreed ocular sequence appearing inside a confirmed REM period, but one was enough to demonstrate that the thing was possible, that the method worked, that a person could be simultaneously asleep, in verified dreaming sleep, and capable of deliberate voluntary communication with the waking world outside. A few years later, at Stanford University, a researcher named Stephen LaBerge extended and systematized the protocol. The early demonstrations had been proof of concept. What LaBerge and his colleagues began to produce was a body of work, a series of controlled studies with multiple participants, repeated across different nights, generating a record of signals that could be examined statistically and compared across individuals. A single case could be a curiosity, a pattern across many cases, many nights, many sleepers, produced in a controlled environment with verified physiological conditions, was a different category of finding. LaBerge published one of the earliest peer-reviewed accounts using the ocular signal method in 1980 in a journal called Perceptual and Motor Skills, establishing the basic form of the protocol that subsequent researchers would adopt, modify, and carry into laboratories across several continents. The publication of that work opened the door to independent replication. Independent replication is not a formality. It is the mechanism by which a scientific finding crosses the threshold from a result that happened once in one place under one set of conditions to a result that holds across different places, different conditions, different researchers with no interest in confirming what someone else found. The history of science contains many findings that were once celebrated and later could not be replicated. The history of science also contains findings that have been replicated many times in many places by researchers with different methods and different assumptions, and that have survived each test. The eye signal protocol for lucid dreaming became one of the latter. Teams in Germany took up the method. Researchers in the United Kingdom worked with it. Laboratories in Japan produced their own verified records. At the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, a group led by Ursula Voss contributed not only replications but extensions, moving from the basic question of whether lucid dream signals could be received to more complex tasks in which the dreamer was asked to signal specific ongoing dream activities, and the researchers looked for corresponding physiological changes in the breathing pattern, the heart rate, and the ongoing electrophysiological record. The logic was the same logic as the original protocol, applied to more elaborate questions. If a dreamer signals that they are now clenching their hand in the dream, does the respiratory pattern change in a way consistent with mild physical effort? If they signal that they are now counting, does the brainwave record show any trace of the cognitive activity associated with counting? The answers to some of these questions turned out to be yes, and that affirmative widened the method from a one-bit signal, I am here, I am aware, into something approaching a genuine two-way channel of information between the dreaming brain and the waking laboratory. What had been a question with two possible answers, is the dreamer aware or not, became a window through which the inner life of the dream could be at least partially observed from outside. The dreamer doing arithmetic in a dream produced physiological traces that differed from the dreamer who simply lay still. The dreamer holding their breath in a dream produced a record in the respiratory channel that reflected, in some attenuated form, an actual change in the mechanics of breathing. The dream was not entirely sealed off from the body it inhabited. The body knew something of what the dreaming mind was doing, and by designing tasks that would leave a measurable trace, researchers could begin to read those traces and compare them to the dreamer's account. The subjective account remained essential. Without it, the physiological record was a set of signals in search of an interpretation. A small change in the breathing pattern meant nothing on its own. A change in the brainwave record during a verified REM period was suggestive, but not self-explanatory. It was the convergence of the physiological signal with the dreamer's own description. The exact moment, as the dreamer reported it, when the event occurred in the dream, matched against the timestamp in the continuous record that gave the method its interpretive power. That convergence was never perfect. Memory is reconstructive, as it always is, and the dreamer waking from a dream was reconstructing an experience that had already begun to dissolve. But the degree of correspondence across many trials, across many participants, across many independent research groups, was consistent enough to carry the weight of the conclusion. The method also carried its own acknowledged limitations. The participants who could reliably produce laboratory-verified lucid dream signals were not ordinary sleepers pulled at random from the population. They were trained, motivated individuals who had often spent months or years cultivating the ability to recognize the dream state from within it. The protocol required them to maintain enough of their attention inside the dream to remember the agreed signal, to execute it deliberately, and to do so at the moment of lucidity rather than becoming absorbed in the dream's content and losing the thread of awareness. These were not common skills. The population of people who could perform them reliably in a controlled laboratory setting was small, and it was not a sample from which broad generalizations about dreaming could be drawn without care. There was also a subtler question. The act of signaling, the deliberate decision to perform an agreed action, to reach through the mechanism of the extracellular muscles toward the recording equipment outside, was itself an act of waking-like cognition performed within the dream. Did that act change the nature of the dream? Did the training required to produce reliable signals alter the character of the lucid state being studied, shaping it towards something different from the lucid dreams that ordinary sleepers reported? A laboratory-verified lucid dream was, almost by definition, a dream in which the dreamer was attending not only to the dream, but to the experimental task. Whether that dual attention was the same state as the spontaneous lucid dream of an untrained dreamer, experienced without obligation or methodology, remained an open question, not easily closed. These were honest limitations, acknowledged by the researchers who worked most closely with the method. The history of experimental science contains many tools that illuminate part of a phenomenon while leaving other parts in shadow. A technique that requires skilled and trained participants will always tell you more about skilled and trained participants than about the general phenomenon. A measurement that requires the dreamer to perform a task will always tell you more about task-performing dreamers than about dreaming itself. Knowing those limits precisely is part of what makes the evidence reliable. A finding that overstates its reach is more fragile than one that says clearly what it can and cannot show. What the method could show was substantial. It could show that a sleeping person, during confirmed REM sleep, with electromyographic evidence of full muscle atonia, could make deliberate and pre-agreed voluntary movements using the one motor system that the body's nightly paralysis had left intact. It could show that this was reproducible, not a single chance event, but a pattern that persisted across nights, participants, and laboratories. It could show that the dreamer's subjective report, collected immediately upon waking, aligned with the physiological record, with a consistency that made coincidence or fabrication implausible as complete explanations. And it could show that the moment of signaling corresponded to a state of dreaming sleep, meeting all the standard criteria for verified REM and none of the criteria for lighter or transitional stages. That is a considerable body of evidence for a state that before these experiments existed only in subjective reports and personal accounts. The person who woke in the morning and said they had known they were dreaming while still asleep had been, for most of the history of sleep research, a curiosity rather than a subject. Their account was interesting, perhaps compelling to hear, but it belonged to the domain of the anecdotal and the unverifiable. After the laboratory demonstrations, after the independent replications, after the extension of the method across several continents and multiple research groups, that account had a different standing. It corresponded to something real and measurable. It was not merely a story the waking mind had assembled about the sleeping mind. It was a fact that the sleeping body had recorded for itself, in real time, in the one channel that remained open to it. The polysomnographic trace from one of those verified sessions is a particular kind of object. It is a continuous paper record, or its digital equivalent, unspooling through the night in real time, its several channels running in parallel down the length of the page. One channel draws the brainwaves, their frequency and amplitude, the specific texture of their oscillation at each stage of sleep. Another draws the movement of the eyes, the irregular scatter of natural REM activity, and then, at one moment, the clean, deliberate sweep of an intentional signal. A third draws the electrical silence of the muscles, the sustained near flat line that indicates genuine atonia, the body locked in its nightly stillness while the eyes move with purpose. Reading across all three channels at once, at the moment the signal appears, is to witness something with the quality of a small miracle, though it is entirely explicable and has now been witnessed many times. It is the moment when the silence inside the sleeping body says something precise, and the machine outside listens. Different laboratories recorded that moment in different years, in different rooms, with different participants. The signal was the same: 2 deliberate lateral sweeps, or a pre-agreed pattern of movements, clean against the background of natural REM, inside confirmed dreaming sleep. The details of the room differed, the equipment differed, the researchers differed, the dreams themselves, described by the dreamers upon waking, were wholly unlike each other. But across all of them, the structure of the evidence was the same. The extraocular muscles moved, the brain was in REM, the muscles were silent, the dreamer had known they were dreaming at the moment of the signal, and had found a way to say so. That convergence, reproduced across many places and many years, has a particular quality that individual discoveries rarely carry. A single laboratory finding rests on the care and integrity of one research team, one set of participants, one run of equipment on one series of nights. It may be exactly what it appears to be, and still it stands alone, but a finding confirmed by strangers working in Frankfurt and Hull and Stanford and Tokyo, who had no shared interest in the result other than the truth of it, carries a different kind of weight. The strangers agreed. Their equipment agreed. Their dreamers, who had never met, produced the same signal in their separate darkened rooms. And the machines in those rooms, running through the night, recorded the same thing. The sleeping mind, aware of itself, reaching through the one available channel to confirm what could otherwise only be described. The trace from a verified session can be held in the hands or scrolled across a screen. Its channels run side by side. The moment of the signal sits somewhere in the middle of a long REM period, not at the beginning, where the transition from lighter sleep might introduce ambiguity, and not at the end, where the approaching waking might do the same, but deep within the period, surrounded on all sides by the unmistakable biological signature of dreaming sleep. At that moment, the dreamer in the recording was standing somewhere in a dream. They were surrounded by dream content, the particular imagery, the specific geography of that night's sleeping mind. And from inside that imagery, they recognized what it was. They looked at the world around them and understood that it was a construction, that they were asleep, that the room and the bed and the laboratory and the researcher watching the trace through a small window were, in some sense, the real context for what appeared to be an entirely different world. And then they moved their eyes, deliberately and in the agreed pattern, to say so. The researcher on the other side of that exchange was watching a long scrolling record for a signal that might not come. Most of a night in a sleep laboratory is uneventful from the researcher's perspective. The body of the sleeper goes about its biological work. The stages of sleep progress through their accustomed cycle. The equipment records everything and generates a great quantity of data, much of which will look to later analysis like ordinary sleep. Into that long ordinary record, at unpredictable moments, the signal arrives, 2 deliberate sweeps. The trace that had been unremarkable becomes remarkable. The sleeper in the dark room, whom the researcher has been watching by instrument rather than by eye, has just made contact from the other side of consciousness. There is a kind of stillness in that exchange. Not the stillness of surprise, exactly, since the protocol was designed to produce exactly this moment, and the signal was expected, but the stillness of something that was possible in principle becoming actual in fact, the space between knowing that a thing can be done and watching it be done, closing down to nothing. The researcher watching the trace had designed for that moment, or worked within a design someone else had made. They had chosen this particular gap in the body's nightly paralysis, these particular muscles, this particular channel of measurement, precisely because it offered a path. And then the path was taken. The signal received in those verified sessions was small, 2 lateral sweeps of the eyes, a few seconds of data in a record spanning many hours. Against the scale of a full night's physiological record, the ocular signal occupies almost no space at all, and yet it is the most significant piece of data on the trace, because it was put there intentionally, from inside a sleeping brain, by someone who understood where they were and what they were doing. All the other data on that trace was produced by the body without deliberation, the slow oscillations, the rapid eye movements of ordinary dreaming, the low murmur of maintained muscle tone, the shifting rhythms of one sleep stage, transitioning into the next. Only the signal was a message. The rest was just the body going about its night. The dreamers who produced those signals described upon waking the moment of recognition in terms that varied in detail, but shared a common structure. There was the dream, vivid, internally consistent, following its own logic through whatever landscape or situation the sleeping mind had constructed. And then there was a moment when something shifted, a detail that did not fit, a quality of the light or the setting or the behavior of the dream's inhabitants that struck the dreaming mind as slightly wrong, or, in some cases, No single trigger at all, simply a spontaneous lifting of perspective in which the dreamer found themselves, without transition, regarding the dream from a slight remove, aware of it as a dream rather than lost inside it as an unconsidered reality. That moment of recognition, its texture, its feeling, the particular quality of clarity it produced, was what the researchers were most interested in, and what the eye signal, recorded simultaneously on the polysomnographic trace, allowed them to place precisely in time. The dreamer's account of making the signal was, in almost all cases, consistent with the experience of the dream continuing around the act of signaling. The dreamer did not wake up to make the movement. They remained inside the dream, aware of themselves as dreaming, and from inside that awareness, they performed the deliberate action with their physical eyes while the dream proceeded. The signal existed, in the dreamer's experience, as something they did from within the dream rather than from outside it. The waking body's eyes moved. The dreaming mind directed the movement. The two events were, from the dreamer's perspective, the same event, a single deliberate act with one foot in the dream and one in the room. It is worth holding that image for a moment, though without rushing toward conclusions the data cannot support. The eye signal protocol verified that the state was real and measurable. It provided a moment in time, precise to the second, at which the transition from ordinary dreaming to aware dreaming had either occurred or was fully established. It enabled independent laboratories to confirm the same phenomenon using the same method. What it could not fully capture, what no external measurement has yet been able to fully capture, is the interior of that moment, the texture of what it felt like to be inside a dream and know it, to hold the waking and sleeping worlds in some kind of simultaneous suspension. The physiological record described the boundary. The dreamer's report described the inside. The science needed both, and it used both, and in their convergence, something previously inaccessible became, at least in outline, observable. Across the years in which independent replication accumulated, the eye signal protocol was refined. Signal patterns were varied and standardized differently across different groups, though the underlying logic remained constant. Verification criteria were made more stringent in some protocols, more flexible in others, and the debates about what precisely constituted adequate verification were part of the normal process of a new methodology finding its own standards. The records from Hull and Stanford and Frankfurt and elsewhere did not all look identical. Some were more rigorously controlled than others. Some used more participants, or longer recording sessions, or more sophisticated equipment. But across that variation, the core finding held. The signal arrived. The state was real. The dreamer inside the dream had sent a message to the researcher outside it, using the one narrow channel the biology had left open, and the message had been received. What accumulated over those years was not merely a set of replications of a single experiment. It was a converging body of evidence that approached the phenomenon from multiple directions, different participants, different laboratories, different cultural context for understanding what lucid dreaming was, different theoretical frameworks for interpreting what the signals meant. Science proceeds most reliably when independent lines of evidence gathered with different methods by different people begin to point in the same direction. The eye signal data pointed consistently and across many replications toward a single conclusion that during verified REM sleep, with all the physiological markers of dreaming present and confirmed, a human being could be simultaneously asleep and aware of being asleep, and could demonstrate that awareness through deliberate voluntary action. The paper record of that demonstration, the long scrolling trace with its three parallel channels, its moment of signal standing out from the surrounding data like a deliberate mark in an otherwise continuous flow, remains the foundational physical evidence for everything that subsequent research built upon. Every later study that examined the brainwave patterns of the lucid state, every investigation of the neural correlates of dream awareness, every attempt to induce or enhance or manipulate the state using pharmacological or external methods, rested on the prior confirmation that the state was genuine. That confirmation came from this method, from these signals, from these particular muscles in their darkened rooms, moving with purpose while everything else held still. The last of those signals in any given session arrived and was recorded, and the trace continued. The REM period eventually ended, as REM periods do. The brainwaves shifted into a different register. The sleeper moved through into the next phase of the night, carrying the dream with them into the ordinary amnesia of deep sleep, or slowly rising toward waking. The laboratory recorded all of it, indifferently, the way instruments record everything within their range. And somewhere in the middle of that long record, at the moment the signal appeared, a person in a dream had reached across the boundary of consciousness, using only the muscles their sleeping body had left to them, and left a mark that any researcher in any country reading that trace could find and recognize. The mark was small, 2 deliberate sweeps. It has been found, over the decades since those first recordings, in many countries, in many rooms, always at the same kind of moment in the biological record, always corroborated by the same kind of account from the dreamer who made it. And whatever came after in the science of dreaming awareness, whatever the investigations of brain activity and neural correlates and induction methods and clinical applications would eventually reveal, it began here in the quiet specificity of that exception, in those small muscles still moving in the dark. In the final hours before dawn, the body's sleep changes character. The earlier cycles of the night, the deep, slow, cellular rest of the first few hours, have already done most of their work. What remains in these last dark hours is something lighter in structure, but richer in texture. The REM periods that fill the time between roughly 4 in the morning and waking are longer than those that came before. They are denser with imagery. The dreaming mind runs closer to the surface during these cycles, its activity more elaborate, its narratives more intricate and strange, as though the brain, having handled the body's deepest needs, has turned its remaining hours towards something closer to thinking. This is the territory where the conditions for lucid dreaming are richest. The late REM period offers more time inside the dream state, more of the neurological complexity that seems to support the emergence of self-awareness, and a closer proximity to the waking threshold, a nearness that appears to matter. A dreamer in the 4th or 5th cycle of the night is closer to the surface than one sleeping in the first. The architecture of sleep builds toward these long, vivid stretches, and what researchers began to notice, testing different methods of bringing lucidity into the dream, was that these final cycles offered a particular kind of leverage, working with the body's own timing rather than trying to produce the state at an arbitrary point in the night, changed what was possible. The method that exploits this fact most directly is sometimes called wake back to bed. Its logic is quiet and practical. A sleeper wakes after roughly 5 or 6 hours, usually by alarm, in the early morning, remains awake for a period of somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, and then returns to sleep. This brief period of waking is not incidental. It matters because of what it does to the sleep that follows. When the body returns to sleep after that interval, It moves toward REM more quickly than it would at the beginning of the night, and the REM period it enters tends to be one of the richest and most cognitively active of the whole night. The mind, having been briefly roused, carries something of its waking awareness back into the dream, a residue of consciousness that may lower the threshold at which the dreamer notices the dream for what it is. A large analysis of lucid dreaming studies, completed in 2020, evaluated many different induction approaches and found that this method, used consistently, produced among the most reliable increases in lucid dream frequency of any technique examined. The finding was not a fluke of one laboratory or one group of participants. Across multiple studies in different populations, interrupting sleep in the early morning and returning to rest appeared to align the sleeper with the window in which awareness within the dream was most likely to arise. The body, on its own, moves through the night in a particular direction. The wake back to bed approach simply finds where that movement is strongest and places the sleeper there. There is something worth resting on in that simplicity. The most effective technique is not an external intervention or a pharmacological tool. It is, in essence, a form of timing, a decision about when to sleep that uses the body's own ultradian architecture as its guide. The late-night REM cycle has always been there. The richness of the dreaming mind in those final hours before waking has always been a feature of ordinary human sleep. What the research clarified was that this naturally occurring biological richness could be deliberately targeted, and that doing so reliably increased the probability of something rare becoming something considerably less so. The sleeper sets the alarm. The hours pass in ordinary dark. The alarm sounds, and there is the small effort of waking, of sitting in a room lit by early morning, of allowing the mind to become briefly inhabited by the waking world before letting it go again. The body, when it returns to the pillow, does not begin again from the start. It moves directly toward the depth it had already reached, and this time the mind goes with it, carrying a small, quiet alertness that it did not have before. What the sleeper brings back into that sleep, the specific quality of intention they carry through the transition, is the concern of a second technique, one that operates at the level of memory rather than physiology. Prospective memory is the cognitive capacity to remember something not yet done, to hold a future intention through the hours between forming it and the moment it becomes relevant. It is the same capacity that lets a person wake in the morning already knowing there is a phone call to make. It is a quiet standing instruction stored somewhere in the architecture of the mind, waiting for its moment. In the early 1980s, Stephen LaBerge developed an approach to lucid dream induction that places this capacity at the center. The technique works by having the sleeper, in the brief waking period before returning to sleep, form and rehearse a specific intention, to recognize that they are dreaming when a particular kind of scene occurs in the dream. The rehearsal is not casual. It involves repeating the intention clearly, mentally, several times, a kind of slow, deliberate verbal planting, while simultaneously recalling a recent dream and imagining the scene that might appear in the dream to come. The intention, held and repeated in this way, enters sleep as a standing instruction, a stored plan that the dreaming mind may, if things go well, retrieve at the right moment. Research by Stumbries and Erlacher, examining the technique through both controlled laboratory studies and survey methods, found statistically significant increases in lucid dream frequency among participants who used it consistently compared to those who did not. The effect was not absolute. Not every attempt succeeded, and success rates varied considerably between individuals, but the direction was clear. Holding a deliberate intention before sleep, increased the probability that awareness would surface inside the dream. The dreaming mind was capable of carrying a cognitive plan through the transition into sleep and retrieving it at the right moment in the way that any prospective memory might surface, quietly, from below, when the conditions finally match the standing instruction that had been waiting. There is something slow and patient in this mechanism. Prospective memory does not operate through active effort during the dream. The sleeper does not sustain the intention consciously through the night. They form it, plant it, and release it to whatever processes organize the dreaming mind while the body sleeps. It surfaces when it surfaces, not through force, but through the dream itself presenting the conditions that match the standing instruction. The dreamer recognizes a strange scene, or a recurring element, or some quality of the experience that matches the intention they set before sleep, and the recognition produces the awareness that the experience is a dream. The memory did not sleep, it waited. This waiting structure, the stored intention, the slow surfacing, is one reason the technique is most effective when combined with the early morning timing described above. In those long, vivid late-night REM cycles, the dreaming mind is closer to the waking state, its cognitive complexity is higher, and the conditions for prospective memory retrieval appear to be better. The two approaches, taken together, create a particular environment. The right time in the night's sleep architecture, entered with a clear and rehearsed intention. Both are conditions created from within the ordinary resources of the sleeping mind, using nothing but timing, intention, and the body's own rhythms as tools. A third approach adds a behavioral layer to the cognitive ones. Reality testing, sometimes called critical state testing, involves building a habit of deliberate environmental scrutiny during waking hours. The practice takes different forms, but its essential structure is consistent. At regular intervals across the day, the person pauses and genuinely asks whether the experience they are having is real or a dream. The question is not rhetorical. It is accompanied by some specific check, pressing a finger against a palm and observing whether it passes through, reading a line of text twice to see whether it changes, examining the hands for an extra finger or distorted proportion, an action chosen because the physics of dreams, despite their general convincingness, tends to fail at exactly these small, precise details. Text changes between readings and dreams. Fingers multiply or blur. The hand pressed against the palm sometimes yields. The intention behind daily reality testing is that the habit of scrutiny, reinforced often enough across waking hours, may eventually transfer into the dream state, that a mind trained to question experience will, by the logic of trained cognitive habits, continue asking the question even after the transition into sleep. Controlled studies have found that reality testing alone produces modest increases in lucid dream frequency. The independent effect is real but small. What the research has consistently found, though, is that the habit of critical scrutiny amplifies substantially when it is paired with intention setting before sleep. A person who tests reality throughout the day and then, using the prospective memory technique before sleeping, sets an intention that the next dream will trigger a reality check, creates a system in which the waking habit and the sleeping intention reinforce one another. The critical question carries across the boundary more reliably when it has been both habituated through the day and deliberately rehearsed at the threshold of sleep. There is something almost ordinary about these three approaches taken together: the early morning timing, the deliberate intention, the practiced habit of questioning. None of them requires equipment. None introduces anything from outside the mind's own operations. They work where they work by arranging conditions that the dreaming brain might naturally support and by building cognitive patterns that lower the threshold at which self-awareness can surface inside the dream. The science behind them is real, their effects are measurable, and their mechanisms, circadian timing, perspective memory, habit transfer, are drawn from well-established areas of cognitive research. Their limitations are also real. Success rates vary. Some people find them easy. Others find months of consistent practice, producing only occasional results. The transfer of waking intention into dreaming awareness is at its core an uncertain process, and nothing in the current research can make it otherwise. A different category of approach does not rely on the dreamer's own cognitive habits at all. Beginning with the discovery that cholinergic activity, the presence of acetylcholine, plays a central role in the neurological conditions of REM sleep, researchers began asking whether pharmacological agents that extended or deepened cholinergic activity might increase the probability of lucid dreaming. Acetylcholine is a chemical messenger. During REM sleep, the brainstem releases a sustained tide of it, and this release is among the primary biological drivers of the state's characteristic qualities. The vivid imagery, the narrative complexity, the proximity to certain forms of waking cognition. It is, in a way, the chemical substrate of the dream itself. Galantamine is a compound that inhibits the enzyme responsible for clearing acetylcholine from the synapse. That enzyme, when active, removes acetylcholine efficiently. It is part of the normal regulatory architecture that keeps neurotransmitter levels in balance. Galantamine blocks its action. With the enzyme inhibited, acetylcholine persists in the synapse longer than it otherwise would, deepening and extending the cholinergic conditions of REM sleep. The question the researchers asked was whether this prolongation would push the dreaming state closer to the conditions in which self-awareness can arise. In 2018, LaBerge, Lamarca, and Baird published the results of a double-blind placebo-controlled study designed to test exactly this. Participants used the Wake Back to Bed protocol, waking in the early morning, and then took either galantamine or a placebo before returning to sleep. The doses tested were 4 milligrams and 8 milligrams. Those who received the lower dose showed a meaningfully higher rate of lucid dreaming than those who received the placebo. Those who received the higher dose showed a larger increase still, with roughly 42% of attempts in the 8 milligram condition producing a lucid dream, compared to approximately 14% in the placebo group. The effect was substantial, consistent across participants, and statistically clear. Galantamine, administered during the early morning waking period, significantly increased the probability that the sleeper would achieve awareness within the subsequent dream. The mechanism is not mysterious in outline. By prolonging the cholinergic conditions of REM sleep, the compound extends and deepens exactly the neurological environment in which lucid dreaming has been observed to arise. REM sleep with heightened cholinergic tone is, neurologically speaking, closer to the surface of waking consciousness, more metabolically complex, more cognitively active, producing the particular neurological conditions in which executive self-awareness can, in some minds, resurface. Galantamine does not produce lucid dreaming directly. It adjusts the chemical conditions of the dream state in a direction that makes self-awareness more likely to emerge within it. This is an important distinction, a quiet one, but worth holding. The compound does not insert awareness from outside. It tilts the probability of an experience that the dreaming brain must still generate from within its own architecture. The self that becomes aware inside the lucid dream is not a product of the galantamine. It is a product of the dreaming mind, operating in a neurochemical environment that the galantamine has made slightly more hospitable to the conditions of its arising. The chemistry creates the weather. The mind still has to produce the event. The compound also carries real pharmacological considerations. Acetylcholinesterase inhibitors are not neutral substances. They are used in clinical contexts. They have known side effects, and their use without medical guidance is not without risk. The study that established their effect on lucid dreaming was a controlled research trial, not a consumer protocol. The science established that the mechanism works, and it established the approximate dose at which the effect was observed. What it does not establish is that the approach is safe or appropriate for general use, and the research does not suggest that it is. This is the point at which the science of induction and the science of pharmacology intersect, and the intersection is real and specific enough that it belongs in any honest account of what the research actually found. There is a further category of approach, one that sits at the outer edge of current research, where the evidence is genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain at the same time. It begins with the observation that the onset of lucidity in the dreaming brain is associated with a specific pattern of electrical activity, a surge of oscillatory activity at around 40 cycles per second over certain regions of the scalp, a rhythm that rises at the moment the sleeper signals awareness from within the dream. This rhythm, known as gamma band activity, is associated in the waking brain with integration, attention, and the binding of information across large networks. Its appearance in the dreaming brain at the onset of lucidity suggested a question that was almost irresistible. If this rhythm marks the transition into lucid awareness from within, could the same rhythm, applied from outside the skull, push the sleeping brain toward that transition from without? In 2014, Voss, Holtzman, Hobson, and colleagues published a study in a prominent neuroscience journal that attempted exactly this. Participants were monitored in the sleep laboratory until they entered confirmed REM sleep. At that point, brief pulses of transcranial alternating current stimulation, a technique that passes a small oscillating electrical current through the skull and into the underlying brain tissue, were applied at several different frequencies. The participants were woken shortly afterward and asked to report their experience. Those who received stimulation at exactly 40 cycles per second reported significantly higher rates of lucid dreaming than those who received sham stimulation or stimulation at other frequencies. The 40 Hz signal appeared to have done something. It appeared to have nudged the dreaming brain toward the state it would ordinarily produce on its own, by feeding it, from the outside, the very frequency that marked that state from within. The finding was striking. It was also, in the years that followed, difficult to replicate consistently. Some subsequent studies found supportive effects. Others found smaller effects, or none at all. The method, for all its elegance of logic, has not produced the kind of convergent confirmation that would allow it to be described as a validated induction technique. What it remains, and this is worth sitting with quietly, is a genuinely open area of research. The mechanism proposed is coherent. The original finding was peer-reviewed and carefully conducted. The replication record is mixed. That is where the science stands, and it stands there honestly, without apology. What the tax work introduces, in the way that real science sometimes does, by pointing toward a question it cannot yet answer, is something larger than its own specific results. It points toward the question of what it means to induce a particular state of consciousness from outside the system that generates that consciousness. The methods that rely on timing, intention, and habit work because they shape the internal conditions of the dreaming mind, using the dreaming mind's own resources. They are, in a sense, the mind adjusting itself. The pharmacological approach works by altering the chemical environment of the dream state, changing the conditions inside which the mind operates. But the electrical stimulation approach would, if it works reliably, be something different again. A direct external signal causing the brain to reorganize toward a specific pattern of activity, producing a subjective experience that the brain then inhabits as though it had generated it spontaneously. This is not the same as switching a light on from outside. The brain's electrical activity is not the experience. The gamma oscillations are a marker of the state, perhaps a mechanism, but the experience of lucid awareness, the sense of recognition, the felt quality of knowing that one is dreaming, is something that emerges from within the dreaming mind itself, using the architecture of a brain that the current only influences, does not control. The electricity does not dream. The brain that runs in the pattern the electricity suggests does the dreaming, and whether the dreaming brain will sustain the lucid state once the stimulus ends, and how it relates to the state when self-generated, are questions that the current evidence cannot fully answer. The four approaches, early morning timing, deliberate intention, practiced habit, pharmacological and electrical modulation, form a range. At one end, the pure behavioral methods, nothing is introduced from outside, and the dreamer uses only the resources of their own cognition and the natural structure of their sleep. At the other end, the external modulation approaches, a compound adjusting the neurochemistry, or a current adjusting the electrical frequency of the sleeping brain. Between them, the mixed approaches, Millard combined with wake back to bed, reality testing layered over intention, that use the mind's own cognitive tools in deliberate, practiced arrangements. Each position on this range represents a different relationship between the will to be lucid and the biological conditions inside which lucidity can arise. What the research has not found is a perfect method. No single approach reliably produces lucid dreaming in every person who attempts it consistently. Individual differences in baseline dream recall, in the general vividness of ordinary dreaming, in the ease with which prospective memory transfers into sleep, in neurological factors not yet mapped, appear to produce large variations in who responds to which approach, and how strongly. A person who finds mild immediately effective may find that galantamine produces no additional benefit. A person who achieves nothing from months of reality testing may respond strongly to the early morning timing approach alone. The science has identified mechanisms, confirmed effects, and mapped the probability landscape across populations, but it cannot yet predict which landscape belongs to which individual dreamer. There is a certain honesty in that limitation. The research into lucid dream induction is, by the standards of sleep science, still relatively young. The methods available to study it, the controlled trial, the polysomnograph, the double-blind design, are rigorous, and where they have been applied carefully, the findings are real. But the phenomena being studied are complex, the individual variation is large, and the number of well-powered, independently replicated studies is still modest. The picture that emerges from the available evidence is not incomplete in a way that should create doubt about whether the phenomenon is real or whether the techniques work. It is incomplete in the way that a map of a newly surveyed territory is incomplete, detailed in some regions, sparse in others, and representing a genuine body of knowledge that will grow in directions that cannot yet be precisely anticipated. The science of lucid dream induction is, in the end, the science of working with a brain that is almost but not quite asleep, nudging it from one side or another toward a state in which it can observe itself. Every approach is a different kind of nudge, the timing that finds the richest window, the intention that plants a waiting instruction, the habit that trains a cognitive reflex, the compound that deepens the chemical conditions, the current that feeds the brain its own frequency from outside. Each nudge works by shifting something: the when, the what, the how deeply, the electrical character of the conditions inside which the dreaming mind operates. The dreaming mind, when the conditions are right, does the rest. Before dawn, then, in those long and vivid final cycles of sleep, the alarm sounds at the time set the night before. The body stirs into brief waking. The early morning room is quiet. The mind that surfaces is not fully awake and not fully dreaming. It occupies a threshold, a nearness to both states at once, and in this nearness it carries something that ordinary sleep would not preserve. The sleeper, in the minutes of waking, holds a specific intention. They recall the quality of a dream. They rehearse the recognition they are hoping to bring back across the threshold. Then the light goes out again, and the body returns to sleep, carrying the instruction carefully, the way a hand carries something small and fragile through a doorway. The late REM cycle unfolds. The eyes move beneath the lids. The mind generates its world, its rooms and strangers and impossible geometries, and somewhere inside the elaborate machinery of that generation, something stirs. The intention surfaces, or it does not. The probability has been increased, the conditions arranged, and what happens next is the dreaming brain's own business. That is where the science arrives and quiets, at the edge of what can be measured, looking into the interior of a sleeping mind, that is, somewhere in its depths, looking back. The question of whether the electrical current at 40 cycles per second, applied for a few seconds to the scalp of a sleeping person in a laboratory, genuinely produces the experience from within or only creates its conditions, whether the stimulation causes the awareness or only makes it slightly more likely that the brain will arrive there through its own processes, is a question that the research has not yet settled. It is a quiet, difficult question about the relationship between the physical activity of a brain and the experience that emerges inside it. The current runs through the scalp. The brain it reaches reorganizes, at least briefly, toward a particular electrical pattern. And somewhere in that reorganization, or in spite of it, or because of it, in ways that no electrode can see, a sleeper may know that they are dreaming. The range of methods, from the purely behavioral to the explicitly pharmacological and electrical, forms a kind of gradual descent from the internal to the external, from practices that use the mind's own tools to approaches that modify the substrate of the mind from outside. Each step down that range raises a slightly different version of the same underlying question: how far outside the dreaming mind can the induction of lucid awareness begin and still be said to have produced something that belongs to the dreamer? The person who woke at 5 in the morning, who held an intention quietly in the dark before returning to sleep, and who found themselves standing in a dream, knowing it was a dream, they did that. The person whose brain was organized by 40 cycles per second into a pattern associated with self-awareness, who then experienced what felt like recognition. That is a more complicated question, and it is the kind of question that feels less like a gap in the science and more like a door. What the door opens onto is not yet mapped. The current research points toward it. The 40 Hz frequency, its association with the onset of lucid awareness, the attempt to reproduce that association through external stimulation, these are steps in a direction. Whether that direction leads somewhere reproducible and stable, or whether it turns out to be a feature of a particular experimental context rather than a reliable lever on the sleeping brain, is something the science of the coming years will have to determine. The answer the coming years will have to determine. Whatever it turns out to be, will say something about the relationship between a brain and its own awareness, about whether self-awareness in the dream is a pattern that the brain achieves, or a pattern that can be given to it from outside, or something that does not fit either description cleanly. In the meantime, the most reliable tools remain the ones that work with the dreaming mind rather than on it. The timing, the intention, the daily habit of questioning. Each of these asks something of the dreamer before sleep, a small effort of attention, a few minutes of deliberate rehearsal, a sustained practice across days and weeks. They are slow to establish and uncertain in their results, and they ask the sleeper to invest a kind of patient cognitive effort that not everyone will sustain. But what they offer when they work is something fully interior, a moment of awareness that the dreaming brain produced using only its own architecture, its own accumulated intention, its own capacity to remember a plan it made before it fell asleep. The alarm clock sits on a surface in the early morning dark. Its face shows a time that was chosen the night before, deliberately because of what follows that time in the long arc of a night's sleep. It is a small object and a quiet one, but in the context of what researchers spent decades trying to understand about how awareness can be cultivated inside the dreaming state, the choice of when to wake, that small, patient, precise intervention in the night's own timing, carries the weight of a method confirmed by careful and converging evidence. The body knows what it is about to do. In an hour or so, in the long REM cycle that follows the brief waking, the dreaming mind will run close to the surface. Whether it will find itself there, whether the stored intention will surface at the right moment, whether the practiced habit of questioning will transfer into the dream, whether the chemical or electrical conditions will be hospitable enough, is uncertain. It is always uncertain. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science. It is simply what the sleeping brain is like, a place where awareness can arise, under the right conditions, in its own time, from within. The dreamer is in two places at once, not divided, not confused. Two places, fully, standing inside a world that has weight and texture and the ordinary pull of gravity, and at the same time floating just above it, watching, aware that the weight is not real weight, that the texture is something the sleeping brain has assembled from nothing, that the gravity is a memory of gravity held in the architecture of a body lying still in the dark. This doubling is not metaphor, it is what the brain is doing. Two things are true at exactly the same moment. The dream is completely convincing, and the dreamer knows it is a dream. Both things are present. Neither cancels the other. This is metacognition. The word arrives from its Latin roots, meta, above or beyond, and cognition, knowing, and describes the specific capacity to monitor one's own mental states from a reflective distance. A waking mind does this constantly, with such ease that the doing is invisible. In ordinary dreaming, that capacity mostly goes quiet. The dreaming brain narrates experience without pausing to examine it. It believes what it sees. It accepts the sudden scene changes, the impossible geography, the people who are somehow two different people at once, all without comment. The ordinary dreaming mind is inside the story completely. It has no outside, but the lucid dreamer has found the outside. The reflective layer has returned. And what researchers including Alan Hobson and Ursula Voss have described is that this is not simply waking up, it is something else entirely, something that has no clean parallel anywhere in the map of human consciousness. The dreamer remains asleep. The vivid hallucinatory machinery of deep dreaming sleep is running at full strength. The imagery is as detailed and saturated as it ever gets. And into that already complete world, something like an observer has stepped, the self that can look at itself, the mind that can notice its own noticing. But what this feels like, by the accounts of those who have experienced it many times, is a change in the quality of presence. The dream is still happening. It is still loud and detailed and strange in its dream logic way, but there is now a quality of clarity behind it, like the moment when a piece of glass you thought was opaque turns out to be a window when the light on the other side comes on. The same surface, suddenly transparent. Nothing has changed in the dream, and everything has changed in the dreamer. The moment of recognition is its own specific thing. It has a texture that experienced lucid dreamers describe with some consistency. A small shift, a slight internal turning, a sense of something settling into a different register. Not a dramatic event, not a sudden bright jolt of certainty. More like the way a familiar sound resolves from noise into music. The elements were always there, and then quietly, they are in a different relationship to one another. The dreamer notices something anomalous, a door where there was none, a landscape that does not quite match the expected geography, a face slightly wrong, and instead of the dreaming mind's usual adjustment, bending reality to fit without questioning the bend, something holds the anomaly up and examines it, and in that examination, the awareness arrives. Some dreamers describe it as arriving gently. Others say it hits them all at once, and the effort after that is not to wake up from the shock of recognition. The brain, it seems, can destabilize the lucid state by becoming too aroused by it. The very excitement of knowing one is dreaming can lighten sleep enough to dissolve the dream entirely. Skilled lucid dreamers learn to manage this. They learn to hold the awareness calmly, to keep the reflective layer present without letting it heat the dreaming brain toward waking. This too is a cognitive skill, and like most skills, it takes time. Researchers who've asked people to describe their lucid dreams in fine detail across many sessions and many dreamers have found that the metacognitive quality of the state exists on a spectrum. Some accounts describe a faint, flickering recognition, more a suspicion than a certainty, a vague sense that something here is not quite solid, not quite right. The dream continues, and the awareness hovers at its edge without fully settling. Other accounts describe something at the opposite end of that range, a state in which the dreamer has full access to waking memory, knows their name, knows what day they fell asleep, can recall deliberate intentions formed before sleep, can observe the dream with something very close to the calm analytical attention of a scientist watching a specimen through glass. Same phenomenon, very different depth. And between those poles, a long continuous gradient of partial clarity, fluctuating awareness, and varying degrees of reflective access. What this tells the science is that lucid dreaming is not a switch. It does not flip from off to on. It rises gradually, holds at different heights, and can dim and deepen within a single dream. The state is dynamic. The metacognitive layer is not simply present or absent, but is something the sleeping brain maintains with effort, however unconscious that effort is, and the maintenance can falter, a distraction within the dream, a particularly immersive event, an emotional surge. Any of these can push the reflective layer temporarily back below the surface, and the dreamer is briefly ordinary again, caught inside the story without knowing it. Then something catches the attention again, and the layer reassembles. The awareness and the control are not the same thing. This is one of the findings that the science has made most clearly, and it is one that surprises people who have not thought about it. The popular understanding of lucid dreaming often conflates knowing one is dreaming with being able to change what is happening in the dream. But researchers working with retrospective questionnaire data and with laboratory studies, including work by Tadas Stumbries and Daniel Erlacher, have found that these two dimensions move independently of each other. Awareness does not guarantee agency. A dreamer can be fully certain they are dreaming, completely, unambiguously conscious of the dreamed nature of the experience, while having no ability whatsoever to alter the dream's unfolding. The setting does not change when they wish it to. The people do not respond to their intentions. The dream continues on its own logic, and the dreamer watches it, aware but not in charge. This matters for what lucid dreaming is understood to be. It is primarily a state of awareness. The agency, when it exists, is something separate, something additional, a skill that some dreamers develop further than others, a variable that responds to practice and intention, and may also depend on how deeply established the lucid state is before control is attempted. A dreamer who becomes lucid and then immediately tries to fly across the dream landscape may find the attempt destabilizes everything and waking comes before the flight begins. A dreamer who first settles, who simply observes the dream for a moment, holds the clarity steady, lets the awareness deepen, often finds that deliberate action becomes more possible afterward, as though the reflective layer needs time to root before it can reach outward. The motor system of the dreaming brain is active in ways that have been carefully measured. During dreaming sleep, the body's motor pathways are suppressed. The brainstem sends a signal that prevents most voluntary movement from reaching the muscles, holding the physical body in stillness, while the dreaming mind moves freely through its constructed world. But the motor cortex itself is running. It is receiving and generating signals. The body is not moving, but the brain that plans and initiates movement is engaged, and the patterns it produces during dreamed action bear a resemblance to the patterns produced during actual action that has not been lost on researchers studying the neuroscience of movement. Mental imagery and physical movement share territory in the brain. When a person imagines throwing a ball without throwing it, the motor cortex and the regions involved in proprioception, the felt sense of the body's own position in space, are partially activated. The signal is not as strong as during real movement, but it is present. Real neurons are firing. The path from intention to imagined action traces some of the same circuitry as the path from intention to physical action. This has been known for some time in the neuroscience of sport and rehabilitation, where mental rehearsal, carefully imagined practice of a physical skill has been shown to produce real improvements in performance. What lucid dreaming adds to that picture is a quality of immersion that ordinary waking imagination does not easily reach. When a dreamer imagines throwing a ball in a laboratory, they are lying still in a quiet room, aware of the ceiling and the electrodes and the present waking moment. The imagination is deliberate and somewhat effortful. When a lucid dreamer throws a ball inside a dream, the throw is embedded in a full perceptual world. The ball has weight. The arm moving has the full felt sensation of movement. The arc through the air is seen in real time, with depth and lighting, and the slight wobble of a real throw. The dreaming brain has constructed a complete physical experience, and the motor patterns that accompany it may be correspondingly richer. A study examining dart throwing gives this question a concrete shape. Dreamers practice throwing darts in their lucid dreams, and their waking performance was measured before and after. Researchers including Daniel Erlacher and Michael Schredel found that the dreamed practice produced improvements in actual dart throwing performance, improvements comparable in scale to those achieved through equivalent periods of physical waking practice. The dart in the dream traced its arc through imagined air. The dreaming motor cortex ran through the sequence of aim, release, follow through. The sleeping body did not move, and the skill improved. This is a small finding. Its scale should not be overstated. The studied samples are modest, the tasks relatively simple, and the exact mechanisms through which dreamed practice translates to waking improvement are not yet fully mapped. But the finding is not nothing. It is a real measured effect, and what it suggests is that the dreaming brain's simulation of physical action is detailed enough, neurologically, to train the body's real systems in a limited way. The boundary between imagination and rehearsal is porous in the dreaming state. What happens inside the dream, in some small but measurable sense, matters outside it. The therapeutic territory opened by this kind of agency within the dream has also been studied, though carefully and with appropriate caution about overreaching the evidence. Among the clearest and most replicated findings concerns nightmares, the recurring distressing dreams that visit some people night after night with the same threatening sequence, the same inability to escape, the same physical arousal upon waking that takes a long time to settle. These are not rare. Chronic nightmares affect a significant portion of people across all ages, and for those who experience them frequently, they shape sleep itself into something to be feared. The body begins to resist falling asleep. The night becomes a landscape with a known danger in it. Lucid dreaming offers a specific kind of intervention for this, and a study published in the journal Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics conducted by Victor Spoormaker and Jan van den Boot tested it in a controlled way. Participants who received lucid dreaming training experienced a significant reduction in the frequency of chronic nightmares compared to a group who did not receive the training. The difference was statistically clear. The nightmares became less frequent, and the mechanism that researchers, including Antony Zadra and others who have contributed to this area of clinical evidence, have proposed for why this works, rests on exactly the thing that the metacognitive quality of lucid dreaming provides, the restoration of cognitive agency at the moment of threat. A nightmare is, among other things, a failure of the dreaming mind to exit a loop it cannot see. The fear is real. The body responds with genuine physiological arousal, elevated heart rate, the biochemistry of threat. The events are not real, but the brain processes them as though they are, because the critical evaluative layer that would notice the dream's constructed nature is not present. The dreamer cannot step outside the story. They are in it, and in it there is only the threat, pressing forward. When a dreamer becomes lucid inside a nightmare, when the recognition arrives that this is a dream, that the chasing figure does not exist, that the collapsing floor has no real consequences, something changes in the relationship between the dreaming mind and its own imagery. The recognition does not necessarily make the threatening content disappear. The figure may still be there, the floor may still be falling, but the mind's orientation toward it has shifted. Instead of captive inside the threat, the dreamer is now observer of it. And from the observer's position, choices become available that were simply not available before. The dreamer may choose to turn and face the figure, may choose to alter the scene, may choose simply to wait with the awareness that the threat has no power it did not bring with it, which is to say, no real power at all. Researchers describe this shift not as suppression of the threatening content, but as a change in the cognitive relationship to it. The imagery is still there. The emotional tone of the dream may still be dark, but the meaning of that tone has altered. The dreamer is no longer trapped inside it, subject to it, but alongside it, with the quiet knowledge that it is the brain's own production. This, the evidence suggests, is sufficient in many cases to reduce the frequency with which the brain returns to the same threatening sequence night after night. The nightmare loses its grip not because the content is avoided, but because the mind has learned to encounter it differently. This is a delicate area. The evidence for lucid dreaming as a clinical tool for nightmare disorder is real, but it is not yet extensive enough to stand alone as a first-line treatment. The studies that exist are encouraging and in some cases statistically persuasive, but the field calls for larger samples, more careful controls, longer follow-up periods, and a clearer understanding of who benefits most and under what conditions. The science here is honest about what it knows and what it does not yet know, and the honest answer at this point is that lucid dreaming shows meaningful promise for this application, and the work to properly characterize that promise is ongoing. The dreaming mind's capacity to construct experience from within, to build a world so complete that the inhabitant of that world cannot tell it from reality, is, when seen from one angle, a description of the therapeutic problem that nightmares represent. But from another angle, it is a description of an extraordinary cognitive achievement. The brain that builds that world is doing something that nothing else in the known universe does, with quite the same completeness. It is generating the full architecture of a lived moment, the gravity, the light, the sound, the emotional tone, the spatial relationships, the narrative logic, out of nothing but its own stored patterns and the electrical choreography of its own activity. This is what dreaming is, a complete world generated entirely from within, indistinguishable from the outside world in the quality of its internal experience, and sustained for minutes or hours without any external input to support it. The sleeping brain does this every night, reliably, as a biological matter of course. Most dreamers never notice. The world generated inside the dreaming mind is accepted without question, because the part of the mind that would question it is not fully awake. The dream holds together because nothing inside it has the tools to take it apart, except sometimes it does. Except sometimes something in the dreaming brain does take it apart, just a little, finds the one loose seam, notices the door that was not there, the impossible color of the sky, the way the stranger's face keeps almost resolving into someone else's, and holds that noticing still long enough to read it, and in reading it becomes what it is, a dreaming brain that knows it is dreaming. This moment of recognition, when it occurs inside a nightmare, is the moment the nightmare's power changes. But this same moment, when it occurs inside a quieter, less threatening dream, is simply a door into a kind of experience that has no exact equivalent anywhere in waking life. The dreamer who stands on the edge of a cliff in a lucid dream, the dream cliff with its dream wind and its dream vertigo, and looks out over the dream valley below, does not feel the experience as thin or provisional. The wind presses against the face with real insistence. The height produces the physical sensation of height. The beauty of the landscape, if the dream has built a beautiful landscape, is a fully formed visual event. The dreamer knows all this is generated by the sleeping brain lying in a dark room, and that knowledge does not reduce the experience, it doubles it. The dreamer experiences the dream from inside it and from alongside it, simultaneously. Two registers of reality, running in parallel, two versions of the same moment, one vivid and one reflective, both present. Researchers who study consciousness use the phrase self-referential processing to describe the brain's capacity to include itself as an object of its own awareness. Most of waking life involves some degree of this, the awareness of being aware, the thought that pauses to observe itself thinking. But in ordinary dreaming, this layer is largely absent, and in deep dreamless sleep, it is absent entirely. The lucid dream is unusual in that it reinstates self-referential processing inside a state, REM sleep, where it would not ordinarily be present, producing what Hobson and Voss have described as a hybrid state of consciousness that is not quite like any other. It is not waking, not ordinary dreaming, not a transitional state moving from one to the other. It is something else, a configuration that does not arise naturally in the course of most nights, that requires specific conditions or specific training to produce, and that offers a window into aspects of consciousness that would otherwise remain hidden inside the ordinary machinery of sleep. The false awakening exists at the far edge of this territory, and it stands as the most striking demonstration of the limits of even the most refined metacognitive skill the sleeping brain can produce. A false awakening is exactly what its name suggests, with all the strangeness that the plainness of the name fails to capture. The dreamer believes they have woken up. Not suspects, not half-beliefs, genuinely, completely, with all the ordinary sensory confidence of a person returning from sleep, believes that they are awake. The room is the right room. The ceiling is the right ceiling. The light coming through the window has the quality of the usual morning. The weight of the blanket is the weight the blanket always has. The sounds from the street below, or the hallway, or the other side of the wall are exactly the sounds those places make. The brain has built a perfect replica, not a slightly off reproduction, not a room that almost matches. The replica is indistinguishable to the dreamer inside it from the original. Every detail that the sleeping brain holds in memory about what the waking world looks and feels and sounds like has been assembled with complete fidelity. The dreamer sits up in this replica bed, feels the replica floor under their feet, and proceeds to begin what feels like an ordinary morning, unaware that they are still asleep. Some false awakenings resolve without incident. The dreamer lives inside the replica world for a few seconds or a few minutes, makes the morning coffee in a kitchen that is exactly the right kitchen, walks to the window and sees the street that is exactly the right street, and then through some shift in the dream's coherence, or through the natural lightening of sleep, wakes genuinely and realizes with a feeling that is hard to name exactly what has just happened. Some false awakenings go further. The dreamer, still inside the replica, performs a reality check, one of the deliberate cognitive habits that experienced lucid dreamers train themselves to use, and the reality check fails. Not because the dreamer performs it incorrectly, but because the dreaming brain has replicated the waking world so completely that the usual strange properties of the dream state that reality checks are designed to detect are not present. The text does not shift. The hands look correct. The light switch works. The dream has anticipated the test and passed it. This is what the field of cognitive science calls a failure of reality monitoring, the process by which the brain distinguishes internally generated experience from externally generated experience. In waking life, this process operates smoothly and almost automatically. The brain applies a quiet, ongoing evaluation to its perceptual experience, checking for the properties that distinguish what is seen through the eyes from what is imagined by the mind, what is heard through the ears from what is heard only internally. This evaluation is so fast and so continuous that most people are never aware of it, but it is happening constantly, and when it goes wrong in waking life, the clinical consequences are serious. In sleep, in the false awakening, the evaluation simply does not have access to the cues it needs. The dreaming brain has generated an environment that matches the real environment too closely. The test finds nothing to fail. There is a second kind, described in the phenomenological literature and in the accounts of experienced lucid dreamers, that is something different again. Where the first type is ordinary, familiar room, ordinary morning, nothing overtly strange. The second carries a quality that dreamers consistently describe as uncanny. The room is the right room, but something in the atmosphere is wrong in a way that cannot quite be located. The light is slightly too still. The sounds are the right sounds, but arranged in a way that feels slightly off their usual positions. Nothing is explicitly strange. Everything is slightly strange. And some dreamers, encountering this version, recognize it. They have been here before. In this particular quality of wrong, and the recognition is itself a kind of reversed lucidity, not the dream being recognized as a dream, but the dream being recognized as a specific kind of dream, which is its own strange cognitive achievement. The false awakening sits at the border of something important about consciousness and its relationship to the world it perceives. The brain does not have direct access to the external world. It never does. What is experienced as the waking world is itself a construction, the brain's best model of what is outside it, built from sensory signals, processed through layers of interpretation, shaped by expectation and memory and the prior patterns of a lifetime. Most of the time, that model is accurate enough that the distinction between model and reality is not a practical concern. The model works, the hand reaches, and the cup is there. The model and the territory agree closely enough that the gap between them is invisible. But the false awakening makes the gap briefly visible by demonstrating what the brain does when the sensory signals stop. In sleep, the external world goes quiet. The brain does not go quiet. It keeps building its model, now drawing only from internal sources, memory, stored pattern, the architecture of the world as it has always been. And the result, in the false awakening, is so close to the externally grounded model that even the brain's own monitoring systems cannot easily tell the difference. The model runs on internal fuel and continues to look like a window. This is what the dreaming brain does every night, without effort, without instruction, without any particular intention to do so. It builds, it fills in, it generates the complete texture of experience from inside itself, using nothing but what it already knows. And it does this with such conviction that the mind living inside the construction typically never questions it. The building is invisible. Only in the lucid dream, only in that specific configuration in which the reflective layer has returned while the building continues, does the process become briefly observable from within. And what the dreamer sees from that unusual vantage is something that takes a long time to settle into words, that consciousness is not a window, it is more like a studio. The materials come from somewhere real, and the patterns are learned from a real world, and the output usually corresponds closely to what is actually outside. But the generating, the assembling, the sustained fabrication of felt presence that happens inside, always, even now, even in the waking moment of reading or listening or lying still in the dark. The difference between waking and dreaming is a matter of which inputs are present and how the outputs are calibrated, not a difference in the fundamental nature of the process. The lucid dreamer, standing in the dream with this knowledge held clearly, exists at a point where this ordinary fact becomes extraordinary. The machinery is running, and the dreamer can see it running. The construction is underway, and the dreamer is both the construction and the observer of it. The experience is vivid. The awareness is real. The ground under the dream feet is the brain's own conviction of what ground feels like, maintained with complete fidelity in the absence of any actual ground, and the mind that knows this is also the mind that still feels it. What this means for the science of consciousness is still being worked out. Lucid dreaming is not, in itself, a theory of consciousness. It is a phenomenon, a reliably occurring, measurable, reproducible state in which certain properties of waking awareness reassemble inside sleep. And the theory of what that means, of why those properties can reassemble, of what it reveals about the relationship between awareness and the physical brain that generates it, is not yet complete. The research continues. The questions it raises are old and deep and resist quick answers. Why is there experience at all? What is it for? What is the relationship between the observer and the observed when both are inside the same brain? The lucid dream does not answer these questions, but it does place them somewhere the instruments can reach, somewhere measurable, somewhere recordable, somewhere that a signal from inside the dream can be received on the outside as two deliberate lateral eye movements tracing their clean arcs across a polysomnographic record. The awareness within the dream can be studied. That is the thing the science established, slowly and carefully across the decades of work that accumulated into the present picture. The thing that felt most private, most interior, most inaccessible to outside observation, the quality of knowing from inside a dream that one is dreaming turns out to have a measurable structure. It appears in the electrical record,